Hey guys! Welcome to my channel Time to Sleep. Have you ever wondered how one small decision can change an entire life? Tonight, I want to tell you the story of the lighthouse that never slept. So let's go. The Lighthouse That Never Slept. Part 1, The Silent Lighthouse. The evening sky above the coast of Maine slowly melted into soft shades of gold, lavender, and deep navy blue. Gentle waves rolled across the Atlantic Ocean, their rhythm steady and peaceful, touching the rocky shoreline with a quiet whisper before slipping back into the sea. A cool breeze carried the fresh scent of saltwater and pine trees through the small coastal town of Harbor's Edge. It was the kind of place where life moved slowly. Fishing boats returned before sunset. Neighbors greeted one another by name. Children rode bicycles along quiet streets lined with white wooden houses. At night, the only sounds were the distant waves, the wind, and the soft cry of seagulls. Far above the town, standing proudly on a tall rocky cliff, was an old lighthouse. Its white paint had faded. Its windows were dusty. The great lantern at the top had not shone for many years. Yet even in silence, it seemed to watch over the sea, almost as if it were patiently waiting. Most people in Harbor's Edge no longer paid attention to the lighthouse. Modern ships relied on GPS. New technology guided sailors safely across the ocean. The old lighthouse had become little more than a forgotten landmark. Tourists occasionally stopped to take photographs. Children sometimes wondered what it looked like inside. But few people climbed the winding path leading to its weathered wooden door. To most, it belonged to the past. Only one boy saw something different. His name was Lucas Carter. He was 16 years old. Quiet, patient, kind-hearted. While many teenagers dreamed about fast cars, crowded cities, or becoming famous, Lucas loved peaceful places. He loved old books, gentle rain, wooden boats rocking softly in the harbor, the sound of waves late at night. And more than anything else, he loved the old lighthouse. Every Saturday morning before sunrise, Lucas walked the narrow cliff path carrying a small backpack. Inside were simple things: a notebook, a pencil, a flashlight, a bottle of water, sometimes a small sandwich prepared by his mother. He always climbed the same worn stone steps leading to the lighthouse. He never rushed. Every visit felt like greeting an old friend. His father, Michael Carter, repaired fishing boats at the local marina. His hands carried the marks of years spent working with wood, rope, and saltwater. His mother, Sarah Carter, worked in the small town library. She believed every old story deserved to be remembered. Their home overlooked the ocean. Every evening after dinner, they sat together on the porch watching the sunset. One evening, Michael smiled at Lucas. "You were at the lighthouse again." Lucas nodded. "I think it gets lonely." His father chuckled softly. "It's only a building." Lucas looked toward the distant cliff. "I don't think so. It spent generations helping people find their way home. Now, no one even visits." Sarah quietly smiled. "Sometimes, the things that once guided others need someone to remember them." Lucas never forgot those words. One rainy afternoon, Lucas visited the Harbor's Edge Public Library. The building smelled of polished wood and old paper. Mrs. Eleanor Brooks, the elderly librarian, smiled warmly. Looking for another sea story? Lucas laughed. You always know. She disappeared between the shelves before returning with a thick leather-bound book. It was nearly 100 years old. The title read, The Keepers of Harbor's Edge Lighthouse. Lucas carefully opened the first page. Inside were photographs of lighthouse keepers standing proudly beside the great lantern. Families living inside the tower. Storms that had shaken the coast. Ships safely guided home during thick fog. Mrs. Brooks quietly watched him. Most people don't borrow that book. Lucas smiled. I think they should. For the next several weeks, Lucas returned to the library every afternoon. He read about brave lighthouse keepers who stayed awake through freezing winter nights. He learned how the giant lantern once burned brightly enough to be seen nearly 20 miles across the sea. He discovered stories of sailors who believed the lighthouse had saved their lives. Each page made the old tower feel more alive. Not forgotten. Simply waiting. One peaceful Sunday morning, Lucas climbed to the lighthouse before sunrise. The heavy wooden door creaked gently as he pushed it open. Dust floated through beams of golden morning light. The spiral staircase wound upward into darkness. Slowly, step by step, he climbed. At the top, he reached the lantern room. Its great glass windows overlooked the endless Atlantic Ocean. The view took his breath away. The sea stretched beyond the horizon. Fishing boats drifted peacefully below. White seagulls glided effortlessly through the wind. The lighthouse might have been silent. But the ocean still listened. Lucas stood quietly for several minutes. Then he whispered, I wish your light still worked. Only the gentle wind answered. As summer slowly turned toward autumn, Lucas began visiting almost every evening. Sometimes he brought a broom to sweep away dust. Sometimes he cleaned old windows. Sometimes he simply sat quietly watching the waves. He wasn't trying to restore the lighthouse. Not yet. He simply believed forgotten places deserved company. One evening, while cleaning a small storage room near the base of the tower, Lucas noticed an old wooden chest hidden beneath a faded canvas cloth. It was covered in dust. Its brass lock had turned green with age. Curious, he carefully lifted the lid. Inside lay dozens of neatly tied letters. An old brass compass. A weathered captain's hat. Several black and white photographs. And beneath everything else, a worn leather journal. The cover carried only 2 words. Keeper's Log. Lucas gently brushed away the dust. His heart beat a little faster. He had the strange feeling that he wasn't simply opening an old book. He was opening someone's life. Someone who had watched these same waves. Walked these same stairs. And kept this lonely lighthouse shining through countless storms. Outside, the sun slowly disappeared beyond the Atlantic. Golden light filled the lantern room one final time before evening settled over the coast. Lucas carefully held the journal in both hands. He smiled softly. Perhaps the lighthouse had not been waiting for electricity. Perhaps it had been waiting for someone willing to listen. That night, Lucas sat beside his bedroom window as moonlight shimmered across the calm ocean. He opened his notebook and wrote. Some places become silent because people stop listening. Maybe the lighthouse still has stories to tell. Maybe. I just found the first page. He gently closed the notebook. Outside, the steady rhythm of the waves echoed beneath the stars. The old lighthouse stood quietly on the cliff. Watching. Waiting. And somewhere inside its ancient walls, a forgotten story was finally beginning again. Part 2, The Old Keeper's Journal. The first rays of morning sunlight slowly appeared beyond the endless Atlantic Ocean. The horizon glowed with soft shades of gold and pale orange, while gentle waves rolled toward the rocky shore with the same peaceful rhythm they had followed for centuries. Seagulls floated gracefully through the cool morning air. The lighthouse stood quietly on the cliff. Silent. Patient. Watching another sunrise. Inside his bedroom, Lucas Carter woke earlier than usual. The old leather journal rested on his desk exactly where he had placed it the night before. He looked at it for several moments. It felt less like an old notebook, and more like an unopened conversation. After breakfast, Lucas carefully packed the journal into his backpack and walked toward the lighthouse. The town was only beginning to wake. Fishermen untied their boats from the docks. A small bakery filled the streets with the comforting smell of fresh bread. An elderly man swept leaves from his porch. Everything felt peaceful. Almost timeless. Lucas loved mornings like these. They reminded him that life never needed to hurry. When he reached the lighthouse, he climbed the spiral staircase until he arrived inside the lantern room. Warm sunlight poured through the tall glass windows. Dust sparkled gently in the air. He sat beside one of the windows overlooking the sea. Then, slowly, he opened the journal. The handwriting was beautiful. Neat. Patient. Every letter carefully written with black ink. The first page read. October 3, 1968. My name is Samuel Whitmore. I have been the lighthouse keeper at Harbor's Edge for 23 years. If someone is reading these words one day, it means the lighthouse has become quiet. If that day comes, please don't feel sorry for it. Every lighthouse expects silence eventually. What matters is whether someone remembers why its light once mattered. Lucas quietly read those lines again. Then once more. He smiled softly. Samuel wasn't simply writing about a building. He was writing about purpose. As the morning passed, Lucas continued reading. Samuel described long winter nights when heavy fog covered the ocean. Some evenings, the lighthouse became the only visible light for miles. He wrote about listening carefully to the sound of ship horns echoing through the darkness. He described climbing hundreds of steps each day to clean the giant glass lantern. He even recorded the weather, the tides, the birds he saw each morning. Every page carried deep respect for the sea. One particular entry caught Lucas's attention. January 14, 1972. Tonight the storm arrived without warning. The waves climbed higher than I have ever seen. The wind shook every window in the tower. Electricity failed just after sunset. For several minutes, the lighthouse stood completely dark. I thought about giving up. No ship could possibly be outside in weather like this. Then, through the fog, I heard a ship's horn. One long call. Then another. Someone was searching for home. I climbed to the lantern room carrying only an old oil lamp. It wasn't bright, but it was enough. Lucas stopped reading. He looked toward the ocean. The calm blue water gave no sign of the terrifying storm Samuel had described. Yet somehow, Lucas could almost hear the wind. Almost hear the waves crashing against the cliffs. Later that afternoon, Lucas visited Mrs. Eleanor Brooks at the library. He carefully placed the journal on her desk. She looked surprised. "Where did you find this?" "Inside the lighthouse." Mrs. Brooks gently touched the worn leather cover. "I haven't seen Samuel's journal in nearly 40 years. You knew him?" She smiled. "I was a little girl. My father delivered supplies to the lighthouse every month." Lucas sat quietly. What was Samuel like? She looked toward the library window. He spoke very little. But everyone trusted him. No matter how terrible the weather became. If Samuel's light was shining, sailors knew they would find their way home. She paused for a moment before continuing. "Do you know why he stayed?" Lucas shook his head. Mrs. Brooks smiled sadly. "He once said, 'A lighthouse doesn't choose who deserves light. It simply shines for everyone.'" Lucas wrote those words inside his notebook. He knew he would never forget them. That evening, Lucas returned once more to the lighthouse. This time, he carried a small broom, a bucket of warm water, and several clean cloths. He wasn't restoring the building. He simply wanted Samuel's workplace to feel respected again. Hour after hour, he gently cleaned old wooden railings, removed years of dust from the lantern room, polished the brass rail surrounding the great light. As the setting sun filled the tower with golden light, everything seemed just a little brighter. Almost as if the lighthouse appreciated the company. While cleaning beneath an old cabinet, Lucas discovered something else. A faded photograph. It showed Samuel Whitmore standing beside a young boy no older than 10. Both smiled proudly beside the lighthouse. On the back someone had written, "For my grandson. May this light always guide you." No name. No date. Only those simple words. Lucas quietly placed the photograph inside the journal. He wondered what had happened to the little boy. Had he become a sailor? A lighthouse keeper? Or had life taken him somewhere completely different? The mystery made the journal even more precious. As darkness slowly covered the Atlantic, Lucas climbed onto the small balcony outside the lantern room. The stars began appearing above the ocean. The lighthouse stood silent against the peaceful night sky. Far below, fishing boats slowly returned to harbor. Their small lights reflected gently across the calm water. Lucas looked toward the empty lantern above him. He imagined how magnificent it must have looked decades earlier. A single bright beam turning slowly across the sea. Protecting strangers. Guiding families home. Giving hope to anyone lost in darkness. Perhaps the lighthouse had never truly stopped shining. Its light had simply changed. Now, instead of guiding ships, it guided memories. Before leaving, Lucas opened his notebook. He carefully wrote, "A light doesn't become important because it shines. It becomes important because someone needs it. Maybe people still need this lighthouse. Not for the sea, but for their hearts." He quietly closed the notebook. The wind gently moved across the cliff. The waves continued their endless song below. And inside the old journal, many more stories still waited to be discovered. Stories that would soon change not only Lucas's life, but the future of Harbor's Edge itself. Part 3: A Promise to the Sea. A soft blanket of morning fog drifted over Harbor's Edge. The Atlantic Ocean had almost disappeared beneath the mist, leaving only the gentle sound of waves breaking against the rocky shoreline. The lighthouse stood quietly above the cliffs, its tall white tower fading in and out of the gray morning air like a peaceful memory. Lucas Carter climbed the familiar stone path with the old leather journal safely tucked inside his backpack. The cool sea breeze brushed against his face. Today, he intended to finish reading the journal. He had a feeling its final pages held something important. Something Samuel Whitmore had never been able to complete. Inside the lantern room, everything was still. Golden rays slowly pushed through the morning fog, filling the old tower with soft light. Lucas carefully opened the journal near the end. The handwriting looked different now. Slightly slower. A little shakier. Samuel had clearly grown older. The pages carried the quiet wisdom of a man who had spent decades watching the sea. September 12, 1989. The lighthouse no longer shines every night. New technology has arrived. Ships now trust machines more than light. Perhaps that is progress. Still, I believe every town needs one place that reminds people where they came from. Not because it is useful, but because it is meaningful. Lucas quietly smiled. He understood exactly what Samuel meant. He turned another page. March 3, 1991. Today they informed me that the lighthouse will officially close this summer. I thought I would feel angry. Instead, I simply felt grateful. For 46 years, I had the privilege of keeping one small light alive. That is enough for one lifetime. Lucas looked out the window. The lighthouse felt strangely alive around him. Almost as though Samuel's quiet spirit still walked its spiral staircase. Only one page remained. Its edges were slightly worn. The final entry ended in the middle of a sentence. June 18, 1991. If someone someday opens this journal, I ask only one favor. Please don't let the lighthouse become. The sentence ended there. No period. No signature. No final goodbye. Only silence. Lucas stared at the unfinished words. For several minutes. He couldn't move. What had Samuel meant? Don't let the lighthouse become forgotten. Destroyed. Lonely. No one would ever know. Unless Lucas finished the promise himself. That afternoon, Lucas sat alone on the cliff overlooking the ocean. The waves rolled endlessly toward the shore. He watched a fishing boat slowly disappear beyond the horizon. Then he quietly opened his notebook. For the first time, he didn't simply write observations. He wrote a promise. I don't know how. I don't know when. But I will bring this lighthouse back to life. Maybe not for ships. Maybe for people. I promise. He carefully closed the notebook. Some promises change a life the moment they are written. The following week, Lucas visited Harbor's Edge Town Hall. The building was small, friendly, filled with old photographs of the town's history. Mayor Helen Anderson welcomed him warmly. "What can I help you with today?" Lucas took a deep breath. "I'd like permission to restore the lighthouse." The mayor smiled kindly. "Restore it?" Lucas nodded. "It means too much to leave abandoned." The mayor folded her hands. "I admire your heart, Lucas. But restoring a lighthouse costs money. Repairs. Electricity. Safety inspections. We simply don't have the budget." Lucas quietly nodded. He had expected that answer. Still, walking back home felt heavier than usual. That evening, Michael found his son sitting quietly on the porch watching the ocean. "Tough day." Lucas smiled faintly. "The town can't help." Michael sat beside him. The answer was no. For now. His father looked toward the distant lighthouse. "You know, when I repaired fishing boats as a young man, dreams usually don't begin with permission. They begin with work." Lucas never forgot that sentence. The next Saturday morning, he carried cleaning supplies to the lighthouse. No announcement. No volunteers. No newspaper. Just one broom. One bucket. And one determined young man. He scrubbed windows. Removed broken boards. Cleared weeds from the entrance path. Collected old rusted nails scattered across the floor. By sunset, very little looked different. Yet somehow, everything felt different. Because someone cared again. A passing fisherman noticed Lucas working. The next day, he quietly left a new toolbox outside the lighthouse door. No note. Only a small tag. For the light. A week later, the local bakery sent fresh sandwiches every Saturday. Mrs. Brooks donated books about lighthouse history. Mr. Howard, the town carpenter, quietly repaired the broken front steps. No one organized a campaign. No one asked for recognition. Kindness simply began appearing. One small gift at a time. Autumn arrived. The path leading to the lighthouse slowly became cleaner. Fresh flowers appeared beside the entrance. Visitors began stopping more often. Some simply looked around. Others asked Lucas questions about the old building. Children loved climbing the spiral staircase. Older visitors shared memories of seeing the light shine across the ocean decades earlier. The lighthouse was no longer empty. It had become a place where stories returned. One peaceful afternoon, an elderly sailor named Captain Thomas Reed climbed the hill carrying a small wooden box. "I heard someone finally cares about this place." Lucas smiled. "I do." The captain handed him the box. Inside lay an old brass lighthouse key. "It opens the lantern mechanism." Lucas looked surprised. "You've had this all these years?" The captain nodded. Samuel gave it to me the day the lighthouse closed. He said, "Someday someone with the right heart will come looking." I think he was talking about you. Lucas held the key carefully. It felt heavy. Not because of the metal. Because of everything it represented. Trust. Responsibility. Hope. As evening settled over Harbor's Edge, Lucas climbed once more into the lantern room. He gently inserted the old brass key into a small lock beneath the lantern housing. It turned slowly. Click. For the first time in decades. The ancient mechanism moved. Very slowly. Very quietly. Not enough to produce light. But enough to remind everyone. The lighthouse was no longer asleep. Lucas smiled toward the endless Atlantic Ocean. Outside, the stars slowly filled the sky. Inside, an old promise had finally begun to awaken. That night, before going to sleep, Lucas opened his notebook. He carefully wrote. Sometimes restoring a place isn't about rebuilding walls. It's about helping people remember why it mattered. Today, the lighthouse took its first breath. He gently closed the notebook. Outside his bedroom window, far across the dark ocean, the lighthouse stood peacefully beneath the stars. Still waiting. Still watching. But no longer alone. Part 4, Restoring Hope. Autumn arrived gently in Harbor's Edge. The maple trees surrounding the town slowly changed from deep green to brilliant shades of amber, crimson, and gold. Leaves drifted lazily through the cool afternoon air, covering quiet streets with a colorful blanket that softly crunched beneath every footstep. The Atlantic Ocean remained calm. Gentle waves rolled endlessly toward the rocky shoreline. Above the cliffs, the old lighthouse stood proudly beneath the clear blue sky. It looked almost the same. But something had quietly changed. People had started noticing it again. Every Saturday morning before sunrise, Lucas Carter climbed the familiar path carrying his backpack. Inside were work gloves, cleaning cloths, paint brushes, a thermos of warm tea, and, as always, his notebook. The lighthouse had become part of his daily rhythm. Not because he expected quick results, but because meaningful work often grows quietly. On one chilly October morning, Lucas was surprised to find someone already waiting outside the lighthouse. It was Noah Bennett, his childhood friend. Noah held 2 paint buckets in one hand and smiled. "I figured one person shouldn't paint an entire lighthouse alone." Lucas laughed softly. "I'm glad you're here." Without another word, the 2 friends began working together. One sanded old wooden railings. The other carefully scraped peeling paint from the weathered walls. The sound of brushes moving across wood mixed peacefully with the distant rhythm of the sea. Neither of them hurried. There was no deadline. Only steady progress. A few days later, Mrs. Eleanor Brooks climbed the hill carrying a small basket. Inside were homemade blueberry muffins and a fresh pot of hot coffee. "You boys need proper fuel," she said with a warm smile. She looked around the lighthouse entrance. "It already feels happier." Lucas smiled. "I think buildings remember when people care." Mrs. Brooks nodded thoughtfully. I believe you're right. Word slowly spread throughout Harbor's Edge. Not through advertisements. Not through social media. Simply through conversations. The young man is restoring the lighthouse. I heard volunteers are helping. They've cleaned the lantern room. The old place looks beautiful again. Little by little, more people arrived. Mr. Howard, the retired carpenter, replaced broken handrails. Emily, the local florist, planted white wildflowers around the entrance path. Children collected litter from the cliffs after school. The bakery sent warm bread every Saturday morning. Even Captain Thomas Reed returned with old navigation charts that once hung inside the lighthouse. Every visitor left something behind. A tool. A memory. A helping hand. No contribution felt too small. As the weeks passed, the lighthouse slowly transformed. Fresh white paint brightened the exterior walls. The spiral staircase gleamed after years of careful cleaning. The old brass railings reflected the afternoon sunlight. Broken windows were replaced one by one. Visitors began climbing to the lantern room simply to enjoy the breathtaking ocean view. For the first time in decades, laughter echoed through the old tower. One peaceful afternoon, Lucas gathered everyone outside after finishing another day's work. The volunteers sat together overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. Warm cups of tea rested in their hands. Golden sunlight shimmered across the water. No one spoke for several minutes. The silence itself felt comforting. Finally, Captain Reed smiled. You know, I spent 40 years sailing these waters. I thought restoring this lighthouse was about preserving history. He looked toward Lucas. But now I think it's about something much bigger. Lucas asked quietly. What do you mean? The captain looked toward the sea. When people work together, they stop feeling alone. Everyone nodded. Some lessons needed very few words. Later that week, Lucas returned to Samuel Whitmore's journal. As he carefully reread earlier entries, something slipped from between the pages. A folded piece of yellowed paper. He unfolded it carefully. It wasn't another diary entry. It was a simple hand-drawn map. The title read, Harbor's Edge Memory Garden. Beneath it, Samuel had written, One day, I hope the land beside the lighthouse becomes a peaceful garden where families can sit, listen to the waves, and remember those who helped guide them home. Lucas smiled. The lighthouse wasn't Samuel's only dream. There had been another. A garden. A quiet place for reflection. He immediately opened his notebook. Next project. The Memory Garden. The following Saturday, Lucas shared the idea with the volunteers. Everyone loved it. Within days, neighbors donated flower seeds, benches, small stones, and young trees. Children painted wooden signs with messages like, Hope begins here. Every journey needs a light. Welcome home. Soon, the empty land beside the lighthouse began to bloom. Lavender swayed gently in the breeze. White daisies brightened the paths. Small pine trees framed the garden. Butterflies returned. Songbirds built nests nearby. The once forgotten cliff had become one of the most peaceful places in Harbor's Edge. One evening, a young couple visited the lighthouse with their little daughter. The girl wandered through the garden before sitting quietly on one of the wooden benches. She looked toward Lucas and asked, "Did you build all of this?" Lucas smiled. "No. We built it." He pointed toward the flowers. The carpenter helped. The florist helped. The fisherman helped. The children helped. The whole town helped. The little girl thought for a moment. Then she smiled. "So, the lighthouse belongs to everyone." Lucas nodded. "Exactly." As winter approached, Harbor's Edge looked different. Not because the buildings had changed, but because the people had. Neighbors greeted one another more often. Families spent weekends walking to the lighthouse. Children asked grandparents about the old days. The town had rediscovered something precious. Connection. On the first snowy evening of December, Lucas climbed to the lantern room alone. The Atlantic Ocean reflected the silver glow of the moon. Snowflakes drifted softly past the windows. The restored brass lantern stood quietly before him. Still unlit. Still waiting. Lucas gently placed his hand upon the cool metal. He whispered, "We're getting closer." The wind outside carried his words into the night. Almost as if the sea itself understood. Before leaving, Lucas opened his notebook and wrote, "Hope doesn't arrive all at once. It arrives one conversation. One helping hand. One quiet morning at a time. Today, I realized something beautiful. We were never just restoring a lighthouse. We were restoring each other." He closed the notebook. Far below, the warm lights of Harbor's Edge glowed peacefully along the shoreline. And above them all, the old lighthouse stood tall against the winter stars. No longer forgotten. No longer silent. A symbol of a town learning, once again, how to shine. Part 5, The Light Returns. Winter slowly loosened its gentle grip on Harbor's Edge. The snow that had quietly covered the rocky cliffs for months began to melt beneath the growing warmth of early spring. Tiny streams of fresh water trickled down toward the Atlantic Ocean, while the first wildflowers of the season appeared beside the winding path leading to the lighthouse. The sea remained calm. Soft waves reflected the pale blue morning sky. The lighthouse stood quietly above everything. Freshly painted. Beautiful. Patient. Waiting. Nearly 6 months had passed since Lucas Carter first opened Samuel Whitmore's old journal. During those months, hundreds of people had climbed the hill. Children had planted flowers. Carpenters had repaired old wooden beams. Electricians had carefully inspected every wire inside the tower. Historians had helped restore old photographs. Artists had painted beautiful signs explaining the lighthouse's history. No one had rushed. Everyone understood that beautiful things deserve patience. One crisp Monday morning, Lucas stood beside the giant lantern mechanism with Mr. Daniel Foster, an electrical engineer from Portland. The engineer slowly examined the restored equipment. Every gear. Every bearing. Every polished brass wheel. After several quiet minutes, he smiled. "I've restored many historic lighthouses." He looked toward Lucas. "I've never seen a community care this much." Lucas smiled softly. "It isn't just a lighthouse anymore." Daniel nodded. "I can see that." For the next several days, the entire town worked together preparing for something special. Not a grand ceremony. Not a television event. Simply the first lighting. Children carefully cleaned every window inside the lantern room. Garden volunteers planted fresh spring flowers around the entrance. The bakery prepared warm cinnamon bread. Fishermen decorated the harbor with small white flags. Even the church bells were polished for the occasion. The whole town seemed to breathe with quiet excitement. Mrs. Eleanor Brooks spent the afternoon arranging a small historical display inside the lighthouse. She placed Samuel Whitmore's photograph near the entrance. Beside it rested his weathered captain's hat, his brass compass, and the old journal. A small handwritten sign read, "Every light begins with someone willing to keep it burning." Visitors stopped for several moments before continuing upstairs. Some smiled. Some quietly wiped away tears. Late Friday evening, Lucas climbed alone into the lantern room. The final inspection had been completed. Everything was ready. The great Fresnel lens sparkled beneath the soft glow of the setting sun. Lucas slowly walked around it. The polished glass reflected hundreds of tiny beams of golden light. He imagined Samuel standing in the same room decades earlier, checking every bolt, cleaning every window, watching over the sea. Lucas gently whispered, "I hope we did it right." The quiet room seemed almost to answer him. The following evening, the people of Harbor's Edge gathered on the grassy hillside below the lighthouse. Families brought blankets. Children carried small lanterns. Older couples held warm cups of tea. Nobody shouted. Nobody hurried. Everyone simply waited together. The Atlantic Ocean stretched endlessly before them. The sky slowly changed from bright blue to deep orange. Then pink. Then soft purple. Finally, night arrived. Inside the lantern room, Lucas stood beside Mayor Helen Anderson, Captain Thomas Reed, Mrs. Brooks, Michael, Sarah, Noah, the people who had helped from the very beginning. Mayor Anderson looked toward Lucas. "I believe this honor belongs to you." Lucas gently shook his head. "It belongs to all of us." She smiled. "Then let's do it together." One by one, they each placed a hand upon the large brass switch. For a brief moment, no one spoke. The room filled only with the quiet sound of waves below. Then, slowly, the switch moved. A gentle hum echoed through the tower. The ancient gears began turning. The magnificent Fresnel lens slowly rotated for the first time in more than 30 years. One brilliant beam of warm white light reached into the darkness. It swept across the Atlantic Ocean. Then another. Then another. The lighthouse was shining again. Outside, a quiet gasp spread across the crowd. Children pointed toward the moving light. Older fishermen removed their hats. Some hugged one another. Others simply stood silently watching. No fireworks filled the sky. No loud music played. Only applause. Gentle. Heartfelt. Respectful. The kind of applause given not for entertainment, but for gratitude. Far out at sea, A small fishing boat noticed the beam. Captain Maria Collins smiled as the light slowly crossed the water. She quietly spoke to her young deckhand. "My grandfather used to tell me stories about that lighthouse." She looked toward the distant cliff. "I never thought I'd see it shine again." The young sailor smiled. "It feels comforting." Maria nodded. "Exactly." Back on shore, Lucas stepped outside onto the narrow balcony surrounding the lantern room. The cool spring breeze moved gently through his hair. Below him, harbor's edge glowed peacefully. The lighthouse beam slowly circled above the sleeping town. Across the calm ocean, toward the endless horizon. Not because modern ships needed it, but because people did. It reminded them that some lights should never disappear. Later that evening, the town gathered inside the newly restored memory garden. Soft lanterns hung from young pine trees. Neighbors shared homemade soup. Children laughed quietly while chasing fireflies. A local violinist played gentle melodies beneath the stars. Everything felt wonderfully simple. No speeches. No trophies. No headlines. Only community. Only gratitude. As the celebration slowly came to an end, Captain Reed approached Lucas. The old sailor looked toward the shining lighthouse. "You know, I spent half my life believing the lighthouse saved sailors." Lucas smiled. "And now?" The captain watched the moving beam. "I think it saved us." Lucas didn't answer. He simply smiled. Some truths needed no explanation. That night, long after everyone had gone home, Lucas climbed once more to the lantern room. The great light continued turning quietly above him. He sat beside the old journal, opened his notebook, and carefully wrote. Tonight the lighthouse shined again. Not because the darkness became greater, but because enough people chose to become the light. Perhaps every town has a forgotten place waiting for someone to care. Perhaps hope has always worked this way. One heart, then another, until the whole world grows a little brighter. He gently closed the notebook. Outside, the beam continued sweeping peacefully across the Atlantic. Far below, the waves whispered against the cliffs exactly as they always had. And somewhere beyond the horizon, another traveler saw the quiet light and smiled, knowing that someone, somewhere, was still keeping watch. Part 6, Stories Across the Ocean. Summer arrived quietly along the coast of Maine. The mornings became warmer. Wildflowers covered the grassy cliffs surrounding the lighthouse. The Atlantic Ocean sparkled beneath clear blue skies, while gentle waves rolled endlessly toward the shore with their familiar, calming rhythm. Every sunrise painted the horizon in soft shades of gold and peach. Every evening ended beneath a sky filled with countless stars. The lighthouse stood above it all. Its great lantern turned slowly through the night. Steady. Peaceful. Faithful. Just as it had generations before. Only a few months had passed since the light returned. Yet something remarkable had begun to happen. Visitors started arriving. At first, only a handful. A retired couple from Vermont. A family from Boston. A photographer from New Hampshire. They had heard about the restored lighthouse through friends. Some stayed only an hour. Others remained until sunset. Almost everyone left smiling. One Saturday morning, Lucas noticed a young woman sitting alone on one of the benches in the memory garden. She quietly watched the ocean while holding a small envelope. Her name was Emily Ross. She had driven nearly 7 hours from Pennsylvania. Lucas greeted her gently. "Beautiful morning." She smiled. "It really is." After a long silence she said, "My grandfather was a sailor. He passed away last year. He always talked about a lighthouse in Maine that reminded him to never lose hope." Lucas listened quietly. Emily carefully placed the envelope beneath a small oak tree. "It contains one of his letters. He wanted it to stay somewhere peaceful." Lucas nodded. "It will." Neither of them spoke again for several minutes. The silence itself became part of the conversation. As summer continued, more stories arrived. A retired Navy captain visited every July. An elderly teacher came each autumn to read quietly beside the cliffs. A young artist painted the lighthouse during sunrise for an entire week. A little boy left a drawing that simply read, "Thank you for keeping the light on." Lucas carefully placed every letter, drawing, and photograph inside a special wooden cabinet near the entrance. He called it the memory wall. Soon the memory wall became one of the most beloved places inside the lighthouse. Visitors left handwritten notes from all over America. Some were joyful. Some were deeply personal. Many spoke about hope. One read, "When I lost my job, I felt completely lost. Walking here reminded me that storms always pass." Another said, "I came here after losing my father. The sound of the waves gave me peace I hadn't felt in months." Another simply read, "Thank you. Nothing more. Nothing less." Sometimes the shortest words carried the deepest meaning. One warm August afternoon, a large tour bus stopped near harbor's edge. Children from a summer nature camp climbed the path laughing together. Lucas welcomed them warmly. Inside the lantern room, one curious boy raised his hand. "Mr. Carter, if GPS exists, why do we still need lighthouses?" Several adults smiled. Lucas looked toward the ocean before answering. "Ships may not need them anymore." He paused. "But people still need places that remind them to slow down, to remember, to hope." The children became unusually quiet. Even at 12 years old, they understood. That evening, Mrs. Eleanor Brooks brought Lucas another old box discovered in the library archives. Inside were faded newspaper clippings dating back almost a century. One headline read, "Lighthouse Guides Ship Through Historic Storm." Another showed Samuel Whitmore standing beside exhausted sailors. Lucas smiled. "This place has always helped people." Mrs. Brooks nodded. "It simply helps them in different ways now." By early September, Harbor's Edge welcomed visitors from beyond the United States. A couple from Scotland. A photographer from Japan. A retired lighthouse keeper from Norway. An environmental researcher from New Zealand. Each had traveled for different reasons. Yet each left saying almost the same thing. "This place feels peaceful." The lighthouse had quietly become something no one had planned. A sanctuary. One rainy afternoon, Lucas met an elderly man sitting inside the lantern room. His name was Arthur Bennett. He carried a faded photograph. It showed a young sailor standing beside Samuel Whitmore in 1974. Arthur smiled. "That's me." Lucas looked surprised. "You knew Samuel?" Arthur laughed softly. "I spent one terrible night here during a storm. The sea nearly took our boat." He looked toward the great lantern. "If Samuel hadn't kept this light burning, I wouldn't be here today." Lucas listened carefully. Arthur continued. "You know what I remember most?" "The light?" Arthur smiled. "No. The kindness. He made us hot soup, gave us dry blankets, and told us, 'Every storm ends eventually.'" Arthur looked around the lantern room. "I've carried those words my entire life." Lucas quietly wrote them into his notebook. As autumn approached once again, Harbor's Edge no longer felt like a forgotten fishing town. It had become a place people searched for. Not because it was famous, but because it offered something increasingly rare. Stillness. No crowded attractions. No loud entertainment. Only waves. Wind. Stars. And a lighthouse that quietly reminded visitors to breathe. One evening, Mayor Helen Anderson climbed to the top of the tower. She stood beside Lucas watching the sunset. "I received an interesting phone call today." Lucas smiled. "What happened?" "The National Historic Preservation Society wants to recognize Harbor's Edge." Lucas looked surprised. "They've heard about the lighthouse. And the memory garden. And everything this town has done together." Lucas remained silent. Recognition had never been the goal. The mayor smiled. "Don't worry. They're not coming to change anything. They simply want to learn." Lucas looked toward the ocean. "I hope they understand." "Understand what?" "That this place wasn't restored by money. It was restored by kindness." The mayor smiled. "I think that's exactly what impressed them." Later that night, Lucas climbed onto the balcony outside the lantern room. The stars stretched endlessly above the Atlantic. The lighthouse beam slowly swept across the sleeping sea. Far below, the memory garden glowed beneath soft lanterns. The breeze carried the scent of pine trees and salt water. Lucas opened his notebook one more time. He wrote slowly. "Every visitor arrives carrying a different story. Some bring joy. Some bring grief. Some bring questions. Yet almost everyone leaves carrying the same thing. A little more peace. Perhaps that has always been the true purpose of a lighthouse. Not simply to guide ships, but to remind people that even in darkness, a quiet light is enough." He gently closed the notebook. The ocean continued singing its endless lullaby. The lighthouse kept turning patiently beneath the stars. And somewhere beyond the horizon, another traveler had just begun the journey toward Harbor's Edge, carrying a story that would soon become part of its quiet legacy. Part 7, A Home for Every Traveler. Summer slowly faded into another peaceful autumn. The first cool breeze drifted across the Atlantic Ocean, carrying the fresh scent of pine forests and salt water through the quiet streets of Harbor's Edge. The lighthouse stood proudly on its rocky cliff. Every evening, as the sun slipped below the horizon, its warm white beam slowly turned across the sea. Not because ships depended on it anymore, but because it had become a symbol. A reminder that somewhere in the world, there was still a place where people could simply breathe. Nearly 2 years had passed since Lucas Carter first climbed the dusty staircase carrying nothing more than a notebook and a dream. Now, the lighthouse welcomed thousands of visitors each year. Yet despite its growing reputation, nothing about Harbor's Edge felt crowded. The town had chosen a different path. No giant hotels. No noisy attractions. No flashing advertisements. Only quiet walking trails. Wooden benches facing the ocean. Small cafes serving homemade meals. And peaceful evenings filled with nothing more than waves and birdsong. Lucas believed beauty never needed to shout. One crisp October morning, a young father arrived carrying his 6-year-old daughter. Her name was Sophie. She had recently lost her hearing after a serious illness. She couldn't hear the ocean. She couldn't hear the wind. But she loved watching light. Lucas welcomed them warmly. He guided them to the top of the lighthouse just before sunset. As the lantern slowly began turning, golden light reflected through the enormous Fresnel lens. Thousands of tiny rainbows danced across the glass walls. Sophie's eyes became wide with wonder. She gently reached toward the moving light. Her father quietly whispered, "She hasn't smiled like this in months." Lucas smiled too. Sometimes light didn't need sound. As winter approached, people began traveling from even farther away. A retired firefighter from Texas. A nurse from California. A musician from Tennessee. A widowed grandmother from Alaska. Each person carried a different story. Some came to celebrate. Others came to heal. Many came simply because they needed a place where life felt slower. No one was ever asked why they came. Harbor's Edge welcomed everyone the same way. With kindness. One snowy afternoon, Lucas received an unexpected visitor. An elderly Japanese man named Kenji Watanabe slowly climbed the lighthouse path carrying a small wooden box. Inside was an antique brass compass. Kenji smiled. "My father was a lighthouse keeper in northern Japan. He believed every lighthouse around the world belonged to the same family." Lucas carefully held the compass. The brass had grown smooth from decades of use. Kenji continued. "My father always dreamed of visiting America. He never had the chance. So today, I brought a small part of him here." Lucas placed the compass beside Samuel Whitmore's journal. 2 different countries. 2 different lives. One shared purpose. As the months passed, the memory wall became too small. Letters arrived almost every day. Children mailed colorful drawings. Teachers sent classroom projects. Families shared photographs taken beside the lighthouse. Veterans wrote about finding peace. Students wrote about finding courage. One letter simply said, "Thank you for giving the world one quiet place." Lucas read every letter personally. Every evening before locking the lighthouse, he carefully placed the newest ones into large wooden albums. He believed every story deserved to be remembered. Early one spring morning, Lucas stood outside watching the sunrise when Noah approached carrying a rolled-up blueprint. "I've been thinking." Lucas smiled. "That's usually dangerous." Noah laughed. "I think it's time." "Time for what?" "A small visitor center. Nothing commercial. Just a place where people can sit, read old journals, drink tea, and learn about the lighthouse." Lucas looked toward the ocean. He imagined visitors resting quietly after long journeys. Reading stories. Watching the sea. Listening to the waves. He smiled. "I think Samuel would have liked that." Construction began quietly during the spring. Local carpenters used reclaimed wood from old fishing docks. Large windows overlooked the Atlantic. Shelves held books about the sea, history, and hope. Comfortable rocking chairs faced the water. A stone fireplace warmed visitors during winter. No televisions. No loud music. Only books. Tea. And silence. The townspeople named it the Harbor House. Its entrance displayed a simple wooden sign. "Come in quietly. Leave peacefully." Soon, the Harbor House became almost as beloved as the lighthouse itself. Travelers spent hours reading. Children listened to grandparents tell stories. Artists painted beside the windows. Writers filled notebooks while rain tapped softly against the glass. Sometimes people spoke. Sometimes they didn't. No one felt uncomfortable with silence there. In Harbor's Edge, silence was never empty. It was restful. One rainy evening, Lucas noticed a teenage boy sitting alone inside the Harbor House. The boy stared out the window for nearly an hour without speaking. Before leaving, he handed Lucas a folded note. It read, "I've been struggling for a long time. Today was the first day in months that my mind felt quiet. Thank you." Lucas folded the note carefully. He didn't know the boy's full story. He didn't need to. Sometimes the greatest kindness was simply offering someone a peaceful place to rest. That summer, Harbor's Edge received an invitation from the National Heritage Foundation. The lighthouse had been selected as one of America's most inspiring historic community restoration projects. Reporters wanted interviews. Television crews requested documentaries. Large companies offered sponsorships. Lucas politely declined almost all of them. When the mayor asked why, he smiled. If too many cameras arrive, the silence disappears. And without silence, this place becomes something else. The mayor nodded. She understood completely. Some treasures were protected not by walls, but by simplicity. One evening, Captain Thomas Reed stood beside Lucas watching the lighthouse beam sweep across the ocean. "You know," he said quietly, "I've spent my whole life sailing. I've visited famous ports all over the world." He smiled. But this. He looked toward the peaceful harbor house, the memory garden, and the glowing lighthouse. "This feels like home." Lucas smiled. "I think that's why people keep coming. Not because they're searching for the lighthouse. They're searching for the feeling it gives them." Later that night, after the last visitors had left, Lucas climbed to the lantern room. The stars filled the sky. The Atlantic shimmered beneath the moonlight. The lighthouse turned slowly. Faithfully. Without asking for recognition. Lucas opened his notebook and wrote. Home is not always the place where we were born. Sometimes. Home is the place that reminds us who we are. If one quiet lighthouse can help even a single traveler feel less alone, then its light has never stopped working. He gently closed the notebook. Far below, the waves continued their endless lullaby. The harbor house glowed warmly beside the memory garden. The lighthouse watched peacefully over them all. And somewhere, beyond the dark horizon, another traveler had just seen its light and quietly whispered, I'm almost home. Part 8, The Letters That Changed Lives. Another peaceful year passed over harbor's edge. The seasons continued their gentle rhythm. Spring covered the cliffs with colorful wildflowers. Summer filled the air with the songs of seabirds. Autumn painted every maple tree with brilliant shades of gold and crimson. Winter wrapped the lighthouse in soft white snow beneath quiet moonlit skies. Through every season, the lighthouse never missed an evening. Every sunset, its warm beam slowly turned across the Atlantic Ocean. Patient, steady, comforting. Like an old friend quietly saying, You're not alone. By now, Harbor's Edge had become known throughout America as one of the most peaceful places to visit. People didn't come searching for excitement. They came searching for silence. And somehow, they always found it. One crisp spring morning, the town's small post office received something unexpected. Not one letter. Not 10. But hundreds. Within weeks, hundreds became thousands. Letters arrived from every corner of the United States. New York, Texas, California, Montana, Alaska, Florida, even from countries across the ocean. England, Japan, Australia, Norway, Brazil. Every envelope carried a different story. But almost all of them ended with the same words. Thank you. The town librarian, Mrs. Eleanor Brooks, smiled as she looked at the growing piles of mail. I think we're going to need another room. Lucas laughed softly. I never imagined this. Mrs. Brooks replied. The lighthouse didn't just return its light. It gave people a reason to write again. Soon, the harbor house opened a new room. It became known as the letter room. The walls were lined with beautiful wooden shelves. Every letter was carefully protected inside glass albums. Visitors could quietly read them while gentle piano music played in the background. Some smiled. Some cried. Most simply sat silently for a while afterward. One afternoon, Lucas opened a letter written by an elementary school teacher from Colorado. It read, Every Friday, I read one of your Lighthouse stories to my students. After each story, they write one kind thing they can do for someone else that weekend. Thank you for teaching kindness without ever meeting us. Lucas quietly closed the letter. He smiled toward the ocean. The lighthouse was reaching places he had never even seen. Another envelope came from an 82-year-old woman named Margaret. Inside was a faded black and white photograph. It showed her husband wearing a Navy uniform. Her letter read, My husband passed away 5 years ago. He always wanted us to visit Harbor's Edge together. Last month I finally came alone. For the first time since losing him. I slept peacefully. The waves reminded me that love never really leaves. It simply changes form. Thank you. Lucas gently placed the photograph inside the memory archive. He whispered, "I'm glad you came." As summer arrived, thousands of letters continued filling the shelves. One came from a young soldier stationed overseas. Every night before sleeping, I watch videos of the lighthouse. The sound of the waves reminds me of home. One day, I'll visit in person. Another arrived from a 12-year-old girl. When I grow up, I want to build places where people feel safe. Just like your lighthouse. Lucas carefully saved every one. No letter was ever thrown away. Every voice mattered. One quiet evening, Noah entered the letter room carrying a large wooden chest. Lucas looked up. "What's that?" Noah smiled. "I've been thinking. We should preserve these forever." Inside the chest were handcrafted cedar boxes. Each one was engraved with a different year. The volunteers carefully organized every letter by date. They believed future generations deserved to read them. Not because they were famous, but because they were honest. Later that autumn, a television producer visited Harbor's Edge. She wanted to create a national documentary. It could make this place famous. Lucas thanked her kindly. Then gently declined. She looked surprised. "Why?" Lucas smiled. "Because we're not trying to become famous. We're trying to remain peaceful." She looked around. Families reading quietly. Children drawing the lighthouse. Couples watching the sunset without speaking. She slowly smiled. "I understand. Sometimes. Not changing was the greatest success." As the years passed, the lighthouse continued collecting stories. Some joyful. Some heartbreaking. Some hopeful. One evening, Lucas noticed a teenage boy quietly placing a folded letter into the visitor mailbox. Before leaving, the boy simply smiled. Later that night, Lucas opened it. "Dear Lighthouse. I came here because I didn't know what to do with my future. I thought I needed all the answers immediately. Watching your light turn slowly across the ocean taught me something. Life doesn't have to move quickly to move forward. Thank you for reminding me to be patient." Lucas read the letter twice. Then carefully placed it into the newest archive box. That winter, snow gently covered the memory garden. The harbor house fireplace glowed warmly every evening. Visitors quietly read letters while sipping tea beside the windows. Outside, the lighthouse beam crossed the snowy coastline exactly as it crossed the summer sea. The seasons changed. The light remained. One peaceful night, Lucas climbed alone to the lantern room. The stars stretched endlessly above him. The Atlantic shimmered beneath silver moonlight. He opened his notebook. Its pages had become worn after years of writing. He slowly wrote, "I once believed I was restoring an old lighthouse. Now I understand. It was restoring people. Not through speeches. Not through success. But through something much quieter. A place where strangers could remember hope. Perhaps. That has always been the brightest kind of light. He gently closed the notebook. Below him, the letter room rested peacefully. Thousands of handwritten stories slept safely inside their cedar boxes. The memory garden swayed softly beneath the winter breeze. The harbor house glowed warmly beside the cliffs. And above them all, the lighthouse continued shining. Not for recognition. Not for history. But for every heart still searching for a quiet place to rest. Part 9, The Keeper's Greatest Gift. The years drifted by as quietly as the tides. Spring became summer. Summer gently faded into autumn. Autumn welcomed peaceful winters, where soft snow covered the cliffs and the lighthouse stood like a glowing star above the sleeping ocean. Nothing ever hurried in harbor's edge. And perhaps that was exactly why people loved it. The lighthouse had become more than a historic landmark. It had become a feeling. A place where busy lives slowed down. Where worried minds became calm. Where strangers quietly remembered that the world was still filled with kindness. Lucas Carter was no longer the 16-year-old boy who had climbed the hill carrying only a notebook. Now, nearly 25 years had passed. His dark hair had begun to show gentle streaks of silver. Fine lines rested around his warm smile. Yet every evening, just before sunset, he still climbed the spiral staircase. Step by step. Exactly as he always had. Some traditions never needed to change. Every afternoon, Lucas performed the same simple routine. He polished the great Fresnel lens. Checked every window. Walked through the memory garden. Read a few letters from visitors. Then climbed to the lantern room before sunset. The lighthouse no longer needed constant repairs. But Lucas believed caring for something was different from fixing it. Things remained beautiful because someone loved them every day. One cool September morning, Lucas noticed a young woman sitting alone on the bench beneath the oldest oak tree in the memory garden. She carried a sketchbook, a backpack, and an old camera hanging from her shoulder. Her name was Emma Sullivan. She had traveled from Oregon after reading about Harbor's Edge during college. For 3 days she quietly explored the lighthouse. She asked thoughtful questions. Listened carefully to visitors. Helped children find books inside Harbor House. And every evening, she stayed until the lighthouse began shining. Lucas noticed something familiar. She wasn't interested in taking the perfect photograph. She was interested in understanding the place. On the 4th evening, Emma approached Lucas. "May I ask you something?" "Of course." "What made you stay all these years?" Lucas smiled gently. He looked toward the ocean before answering. "I never stayed because of the lighthouse." Emma looked surprised. "You didn't?" Lucas shook his head. "I stayed because of the people who found peace here. The lighthouse simply gave them a place to find it." Emma quietly nodded. She wrote those words inside her sketchbook. Over the following weeks, Emma became a regular volunteer. She organized old photographs. Cataloged thousands of letters. Read stories aloud to visiting children. Helped elderly visitors climb the tower. She never asked for recognition. She simply enjoyed helping. The townspeople quickly grew fond of her gentle kindness. Mrs. Brooks smiled one afternoon and whispered to Lucas, "She reminds me of someone." Lucas laughed softly. "I know. Underscore." As autumn leaves floated across the walking paths, Lucas found himself thinking about Samuel Whitmore more often. Samuel had once protected the lighthouse. Then, without realizing it, Lucas had continued the same work. Every light, he realized, eventually needs another keeper. Not because the old one has failed, but because hope must always be passed forward. One rainy evening, Lucas invited Emma to the lantern room. The ocean disappeared beneath thick fog. The lighthouse beam slowly rotated through the mist. Everything felt peaceful. Lucas carefully removed Samuel's journal from its glass case. Then placed beside it his own notebook. 25 years of thoughts, dreams, conversations, letters copied by hand, moments of gratitude. Emma looked at the notebooks quietly. "They're beautiful." Lucas smiled. "They're unfinished." She looked confused. Lucas gently closed the covers. Every keeper leaves space for the next one. Several weeks later, the town celebrated the annual Festival of Light. Children carried handmade paper lanterns through the streets. Families gathered in the memory garden. A local choir softly sang traditional folk songs. The harbor house served warm apple cider and homemade soup. No advertisements. No loud stages. Just neighbors spending time together. As evening fell, Mayor Helen Anderson stepped forward. "I have one announcement." She smiled warmly toward Lucas. "For 25 years, this town has been guided by kindness. Tonight, we celebrate the person who reminded us that history is not something we preserve. It is something we continue." The crowd quietly applauded. Lucas stood, slightly embarrassed. He thanked everyone briefly. Then said only one sentence. "This lighthouse belongs to every heart that has ever needed its light. Nothing more." The crowd smiled. Sometimes the shortest speeches were remembered the longest. Later that night, after everyone had gone home, Lucas climbed the tower one more time. Emma quietly followed. The stars stretched endlessly above the Atlantic. The lighthouse turned slowly. Just as it always had. Lucas reached into his pocket. He removed the old brass key that Captain Thomas Reed had given him decades earlier. The same key Samuel Whitmore had once trusted to another. He gently placed it into Emma's hand. She looked surprised. "I can't accept this." Lucas smiled. "I said the same thing once." She looked toward the key. "What if I'm not ready?" Lucas looked toward the sea. No keeper ever feels ready. They simply care enough to begin. Emma held the key carefully. Its brass surface reflected the warm light of the lantern. She understood. This wasn't ownership. It was responsibility. A promise. Before leaving, Lucas opened his notebook one final time. He slowly wrote. "The greatest gift a keeper can leave behind is not a building. Not a light. Not even a story. It is another person willing to care. Lights never truly belong to us. We simply protect them for a little while, before placing them into kind hands. He closed the notebook, placed it beside Samuel's journal, and quietly smiled. Outside, the waves continued their endless song. The stars shone brightly above the sea. The lighthouse kept turning. And for the first time in many years, Lucas felt completely at peace. Because he knew its future was safe. As dawn slowly approached, Emma stood alone on the balcony. She looked across the Atlantic Ocean. The first light of morning touched the horizon. She gently held the old brass key. Not with pride, but with gratitude. Below her, harbor's edge slept peacefully. Above her, the lighthouse continued shining. And deep within her heart, a new promise had quietly begun. Part 10, The Light That Never Sleeps. The Atlantic Ocean had not changed. Its waves still rolled gently toward the rocky cliffs of harbor's edge, just as they had centuries before. Every sunrise painted the horizon with soft gold. Every evening ended beneath quiet stars. The lighthouse still stood proudly above the sea. Its great white tower reflected the morning light. Its lantern still turned slowly through every night. Patient, faithful, peaceful. Some people believed buildings grew old. But certain places seemed to grow wiser. Several more years quietly passed. Emma Sullivan had become the new keeper of Harbor's Edge Lighthouse. She never tried to replace Lucas Carter. She simply continued what he had started. Every morning she walked through the memory garden. She watered the flowers, straightened the wooden benches, read new letters that visitors had left overnight. Every afternoon she welcomed travelers into Harbor House with a warm smile and a cup of hot tea. Every evening, she climbed the spiral staircase, turned on the great lantern, and watched its gentle beam sweep across the Atlantic Ocean. Exactly as Lucas had done. Exactly as Samuel Whitmore had done. Lucas no longer climbed the tower every day. Age had slowed his steps. Instead, he often sat beneath the oldest oak tree in the memory garden. The same tree planted during the lighthouse restoration years ago. Children loved sitting beside him. They always asked the same question. Mr. Lucas, did you really restore the lighthouse? Lucas would smile softly, then shake his head. No. We restored each other. The children never fully understood those words. Not yet. But one day, they would. One peaceful spring afternoon, a little boy named Oliver approached Lucas. He couldn't have been older than 8. He held a tiny notebook in one hand. Mr. Lucas, I want to build something important someday. Lucas smiled. What do you want to build? Oliver thought for a moment. I don't know yet. Lucas nodded. That's perfectly all right. You don't have to know the destination. You simply have to keep walking. The boy carefully wrote those words inside his notebook. Lucas quietly smiled. Another story had just begun. As the years passed, Harbor's Edge became known around the world. But the town never became noisy. The people protected its peace. Visitors still arrived quietly. Phones were silenced. Voices remained gentle. The harbor house welcomed every traveler. The letter room continued growing. The memory garden bloomed every spring. The lighthouse shined every evening. Nothing became rushed. Nothing became crowded. The town understood that peace was something to protect. One autumn evening, Emma climbed to the lantern room carrying Samuel Whitmore's journal and Lucas Carter's notebook. She placed them side by side. Then added a third notebook. Her own. She smiled. Every keeper left behind a story. Every generation added another chapter. The lighthouse itself had become a living book. Written not with ink alone, but with kindness. Far away, in cities across America, families began creating small traditions inspired by harbor's edge. Parents read bedtime stories together before sleep. Teachers started kindness journals in classrooms. Communities planted memory gardens of their own. Libraries created quiet reading corners called lighthouse rooms. No one copied the lighthouse exactly. They simply carried its spirit home. One small light, creating thousands more. One winter morning, the National Heritage Foundation unveiled a simple bronze plaque beside the lighthouse. It didn't mention awards. It didn't list famous visitors. Instead, it carried only these words. This lighthouse reminds us that the brightest light is kindness shared with others. Nothing more. Nothing less. Visitors often stood silently before the plaque. Then quietly continued toward the sea. Years later, on a peaceful evening beneath a sky filled with countless stars, Lucas Carter returned to the lighthouse one final time. Not because he felt sad. Not because he wished to say goodbye. Simply because it felt like home. Emma welcomed him with a warm smile. Together they slowly climbed the spiral staircase. Step by step. Neither hurried. When they reached the lantern room, the great light continued its calm rotation above them. Lucas stood beside the window overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. The waves shimmered beneath the moonlight. Fishing boats drifted peacefully across the water. The memory garden glowed softly below. The harbor house windows reflected warm golden light. Everything felt exactly as it should. Lucas quietly whispered. It never stopped shining. Emma looked toward the lantern. No. It never will. Lucas opened his old notebook one final time. Its pages had become worn from decades of writing. With slow, careful handwriting, he wrote his final entry. If you are reading these words someday, remember this. The world will always have storms. There will always be difficult days. There will always be people searching for their way home. You do not need to become the brightest light. You only need to become a steady one. Shine with kindness. Listen with patience. Welcome others with warmth. That is enough. It has always been enough. He gently closed the notebook. Then placed it beside Samuel Whitmore's journal. And beside Emma's. 3 generations. One light. One purpose. The years continued. Children grew into adults. Adults became grandparents. New visitors arrived every season. Some came with joy. Some came with heavy hearts. Almost all left feeling lighter than when they arrived. Because Harbor's Edge offered something the modern world rarely gave. Time. Quiet. Hope. On calm nights, when the Atlantic Ocean reflected the stars like tiny diamonds, the lighthouse beam could still be seen sweeping slowly across the dark water. Travelers often paused to watch it. Many smiled without knowing why. Perhaps something deep within every human heart recognizes a gentle light. Perhaps everyone needs a reminder that kindness still exists. And so, the lighthouse never truly belonged to Samuel, or Lucas, or Emma. It belonged to every person who chose compassion over indifference, patience over hurry, hope over fear. Its light never slept. Not because electricity kept it alive, but because kindness kept passing from one heart to another. Like the tide. Like the sunrise. Like the stars above the sea. Quietly. Faithfully. Forever. As the camera slowly rises above the lighthouse, the Atlantic Ocean stretches endlessly beneath a sky filled with brilliant stars. The warm beam of the lighthouse gently circles across the sleeping sea. The waves continue their soft lullaby. The town rests peacefully below. The music grows softer. The night grows quieter. And the final words appear slowly on the screen. Every heart can become a lighthouse for someone else. Thanks for watching the videos.